We are following the breaking news this morning of the Germanwings Airbus crash. A French prosecutor this morning saying that the co-pilot deliberately crashed the plane into the mountains, killing everyone on board. I want to bring in former Army helicopter pilot Amber Smith. Amber, good morning to you. What is your observation on this story?
Well, I think the analysis that came out of the black box voice recording has confirmed what we all feared or hoped wasn't true, was that it's a deliberate act. It's either going to be this mass murder-suicide or some form of terrorism. The officials inside Europe were very quick to point out that it wasn't terrorism, but they also sort of pointed out very quickly that it wasn't a deliberate act in the beginning as well. So we still have to wait and see. They're going to dig into this co-pilot's past to find out what's going on, his family, his background, his upbringing. We know that there was a almost 6-year gap in terms of his training, why that happened. And so I think there's still a lot of information that could come out and sort of change the story.
Well, what about protocol, Amber? I mean, in terms of one pilot leaving the cockpit and then being unable to get back in because the co-pilot locked him out. The Lufthansa CEO saying that we are stunned by the actions of the co-pilot. But how is it possible that the main captain, the senior pilot on board, is unable to get back into the cockpit?
It's actually not that out of the ordinary for one of the pilots to, once they're up at cruising altitude, to get out of the cockpit for whatever reason, use the restroom, whatever. That happens, but there are procedures in place if a pilot leaves the cockpit, that the door has to be secured. In the U.S., a flight attendant has to come and essentially replace the pilot, so there's always those 2 personnel inside the cockpit. But in this case, it didn't happen. They closed the door with the single pilot, the co-pilot, still in the aircraft, and he was able to do that second secure lock, so the pilot who was outside the door had no way of coming back in.
There was also no contact between the control tower and that co-pilot for the last 8 minutes before the flight crashed into the mountains. How is it possible that the control tower has no access to actually what's going on? I recognize we're investigating that second black box, but where else might the control tower get information regarding what's happening inside that cockpit?
They're not going to, aside from radar, aside from voice communication with the cockpit at that, for those 8 minutes, that was it. And if the pilot was not communicating with ATC, the air tower control people, they're not going to have that communication. It's going to be radio silence, just as we saw in this case with this pilot.
What are you going to be looking for in terms of the most important information from that second black box?
Well, the second black box is going to be more of confirmation, I think, to everything that has come up so far in terms of them suspecting this being a deliberate act. But something that I want to point out here is the human factor. We've heard a lot about the psychology into who is allowed to be a pilot and who is not. And something in aviation that you're never going to be able to perfect is that human factor inside aviation. You're never going to fully be able to predict the acts of pilots, and you're never going to be able, it comes into with their safety ratings as well. You are always going to have an unknown element when it comes to aviation because of that human factor. But especially in the U.S., I think that the airline industry has done a fairly good job of minimizing some of those issues when it comes to the pilots.
You wonder what this does to airline travel, in fact, since we have more questions than answers as to how this flight went down.
Yeah, absolutely. It terrorizes the airline industry. That's what it does, whether or not it was terrorism because of an ideology or a political gain. It terrorizes the airline industry. Passengers are going to be wondering, are my pilots competent? What is going to happen if a pilot's having a bad day? And so those are all things to be looking at. But I think in terms of air travel, it is very rare for something like this to happen. It's a very safe mode of transportation, but unfortunately, it's not foolproof, and terrible, terrible tragedies like this do happen.
Amber, thank you very much for your insights. Amber Smith with the latest there. We are continuing to follow this breaking news on the Germanwings plane crash. We'll be right back. Stay with